They say the wind on the Montana prairies carries secrets that only the old can hear. In that vast golden expanse where the mountains touch the sky and the horses graze as if time had stood still, lived Thomas McBride, a widowed farmer with calloused hands and a weary heart. The land was bountiful, but home was empty. Since Martha had left, the house had seemed colorless. The days dragged on between tending the animals and staring at the horizon, waiting for something he himself did not know what it was. The McBride Ranch was known for its organization and strength, but everyone in town knew that the soul of the place had gone with Thomas's wife. What had been music coming from the porch was now just the crackle of wind on dry wood. Even the ranch dogs seemed quieter. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of absence that could not be filled with work or time. The neighbors respected him too much to ask questions, but they knew Thomas was broken inside. At the town fair, he always bought the same things, exchanged a few words, and returned before the sun went down. It was as if his life had shrunk. There were no smiles, no new stories. Everything about him seemed to be kept hidden, locked away. He died with her, some whispered, but no one dared say that in front of him. Thomas was still going strong, but not whole. He was a good man, but now, alone, he was only half of a story that no one else told. Until one late afternoon, when the orange-tinted sky shed light over the fields, he heard a different sound coming from the trees to the north of the property. The sound of an axe, rhythmic, firm, as if cutting not only wood, but also sorrows. Curious, Thomas approached slowly, thinking it was some wanderer or lost worker. But what he saw there made his heart hesitate for a second. It was not a man. It was a woman. Her grey hair was tied back with a scarf, her hands firmly on the axe handle, her eyes focused. She was chopping wood as if she had been doing it since she was a girl. There was strength and dignity in her, a kind of beauty that needed no mirror. Thomas stood still, not knowing whether to interrupt or just watch. Without stopping her movement, she simply looked sideways and said, "The earth is warmer with a fire in the hearth," and she went back to chopping. He didn't answer, but something inside him lit up for the first time in years. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. I will be very happy to read each comment. And it was there, in that silence, split in half by an axe and a look, that everything began to change. Her name was Eleanor. She was also a widow. She lived in a rented cabin at the back of the old Whitaker farm, next door to Thomas's. She had only moved in 3 months before, but she already knew the rhythm of the land, the direction of the winds, the temperament of the horses. She was a woman who had learned to survive without making a fuss. When her husband left, as suddenly as a bolt from the blue, she did not cry in public. She just took her books, her axe, and her dignity and left the town where no one said good morning to her anymore. Eleanor was not easy to talk to, but her eyes carried a story that didn't even need to be told. Her hands showed that she knew the weight of the world. She said little, but each word she said was like a seed sown in fertile soil. She had a habit of tending to flowers even in the cold, as if she believed that beauty could withstand even the cruelest winter. And when Thomas asked her what she was doing there, she answered without hesitation, "I live, like you, only with firewood instead of oxen." In the following days, Thomas began to observe from afar, not with the curiosity of the town gossips, but with the attention of someone who has seen something rare and does not want to scare it away. Eleanor continued with her routine. She collected water from the well, chopped wood, fed the chickens. Sometimes she sang softly while sweeping the porch. She did not wear makeup, but time seemed to have sculpted her with a silent beauty. She was the kind of woman who did not need to prove anything to anyone. One Saturday morning, she showed up at Thomas's gate with a jar of jam. There was too much fruit and not enough time. "Would you like some?" she asked, the sun shining on her silver hair. He hesitated, then took the jar in both hands, as if holding something fragile. "Thank you," that was all. But in that simple exchange, There was more than words. There was a bridge being built between two ancient solitudes. Eleanor walked back the way she had come, and Thomas watched until she disappeared into the bushes. That night, he sat on the porch and opened the jar of jam. It tasted sweet, but there was something else there. A taste of childhood, maybe, or of a new beginning. That night, he slept better. For the first time in a long time, the ranch seemed to breathe again. And the next day, he knew he had to give back. And so, two worlds separated by silence began to come together. The smell of bread baking in the wood-burning stove mingled with the autumn wind blowing through the Montana hills. It was a smell that came not only from flour and yeast, but from memories that Eleanor carried from the past. The stove was her silent altar, where she burned not only wood, but also the sorrows that time had not yet completely consumed. There, among iron pots and simple ceramic plates, she relived the happy days she had with her husband, and accepted little by little that love does not have to die when the other leaves. Thomas, on his side, spent more time near the fence that divided the two lands. He didn't say much. He just listened. The sounds of her house, the whistling of the kettle, the banging of the spoon on the pan. Everything seemed like a melody he hadn't heard in a long time. In his ranch, the wood stove remained cold. He even thought about relighting it but preferred to wait. The wood, somehow, now belonged to what was coming from the other side. The heat from Eleanor's stove seemed to warm even his soul. On a grey afternoon, the rain came lightly, as if it just wanted to touch the earth without scaring. Thomas appeared on her porch with a package in his hat. "I brought flour. I was told your jam goes well with fresh bread." She smiled, but didn't answer right away. She just opened the door and nodded. "Then come in. The oven is already hot." He went inside. For the first time since Martha left, he crossed the threshold of a house that wasn't his, and he felt that, strangely, it was like coming home. In the kitchen, while Eleanor kneaded the dough, Thomas told her about the harvest time, about the calf that was born prematurely, and about the old mare that was still waiting for the owner who never returned. Eleanor listened in silence, only nodding her head every now and then, and when he stopped talking, she simply said, "You still love her. That doesn't have to change to love her again." He didn't answer, but the tears that formed in his eyes said it all. That night was the first time they had dined together. The bread was simple, the jam was sweet, the silence was profound. But there was no discomfort, only peace. The wooden table, scratched by time, seemed like the altar where two wounded souls began to meet. The wood stove crackled, warming not only the house, but also that which they could not name. And before leaving, with his hat in his hand, Thomas looked at her and said, "This land has worked long alone. Perhaps it is time for a queen." Eleanor said nothing, but that smile she gave was warmer than any fireplace. The news traveled slowly, as did everything else in the neighborhood. The widower McBride was having dinner with the new widow from the Whitaker farm. In the town, that was enough to spark glances and smiles hidden behind coffee cups. But they didn't care. Thomas and Eleanor were more interested in the sound of spoons hitting plates than in the whispers of the town. The second dinner came a week later, and the third soon after that. It was as if time had stopped being chronological and began to be measured by encounters. At each meal, a new piece of history was told. Eleanor spoke little, but when she did, she said things that echoed. "It's not time that heals. It's what we do with it." Thomas listened and wrote down with his eyes. He also began to tell her things he had never told even his own children. He told her about the silences after Martha left, about the nights he slept in the armchair so as not to feel the emptiness of the bed. Eleanor then would simply hold his hand across the table, and that simple touch was like a medicine that time never offered. After dinner, they walked through the fields, sometimes in silence, sometimes singing old songs. Eleanor knew the words to songs that Thomas only remembered from when he was young, and they laughed lightly, like two teenagers aged by time but not by heart. Each step beside her seemed to unearth a little more of the man Thomas had buried along with his pain, and Eleanor smiled more too. Her eyes grew brighter, her skin color. One day she brought an old radio. It doesn't work right, but it still sings when you insist on it. And they insisted. Sitting on her porch, listening to the music muffled by hiss, they danced a slow waltz, foot by foot, heart to heart. Neither of them was a good dancer, but at that moment, there was no more beautiful dance in the world. The Montana sky covered them like a deep blue blanket, and the stars seemed to silently applaud this scene that the world had almost missed. And there, in the swing of the dance, Thomas whispered, "I didn't think I would live this again, but now I wouldn't trade it for anything." Eleanor, with her eyes closed, leaning against his chest, simply said, "Neither would I." And in that moment their solitude ceased to exist. They became something new, something made of two halves that were finally whole. And so the ranch regained color, the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of laughter echoing in the wind. Love doesn't erase the past, it just gives us a new place to look. And it was on a windy November morning, as the leaves danced across the golden fields, that Eleanor felt the weight of memories she had long buried. She received a letter with an old stamp from Nebraska. It was from her first husband's daughter, a young woman who had never accepted her as a stepmother, who had accused her of moving on too quickly, who had severed ties with words that echoed to this day. And now, after years of silence, she wanted to talk. She wanted to see her. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, sitting on the porch, the sun beating down on her shaking hands. She didn't cry, but she sat still for hours. When Thomas came to see her, he saw something on her face he hadn't seen in weeks: fear. She held out the letter to him without saying a word. He read it calmly, then folded it slowly and put it back in the envelope. "You don't have to decide now, but don't let the pain silence your will." Eleanor just nodded. And that night, there was no bread, no dancing, no talking, only silence. A silence that spoke louder than any dinner. In the days that followed, she chopped wood harder, as if each blow was a thought that needed to be erased. Thomas watched from a distance, taking his time, but at night he left a loaf of still warm bread on her doorstep. It was his way of saying, "I'm here," and that was enough. Inside, Eleanor struggled with memories, with regrets, with words she wished she had said and others she wished she could forget. Life sometimes forces us to reopen wounds in order to truly heal. One cold afternoon, Eleanor asked Thomas to accompany her to the old road that led into town. "I don't know if I want to see her, but I need to know if I can still go." They walked together, side by side, unhurriedly. When they reached the top of the hill, Eleanor stopped, looked at the horizon, and took a deep breath. She hated me for years, but maybe she just missed me. Thomas took her hand, squeezed it lightly. "Then write. Even if she doesn't read it, you'll have said it." And that day, Eleanor went home and began a letter. The paper was wet with tears. The words came hesitantly, but they came. She wrote about love, about loss, about forgiveness. She didn't apologize. She asked for understanding. She asked for a chance. She asked for peace. And when she finished, she folded the paper carefully, like someone folding their own heart. She put it in an envelope and left it on the table. But she didn't send it. Not that day. She just left it there waiting. Because sometimes the first step isn't delivering the letter, it's allowing yourself to write it. And Thomas, that night, danced with her as if he held something sacred, because he knew every step Eleanor took backward was actually a step toward healing. The letter sat on the table for 3 days. Eleanor stared at it as if she were looking into a mirror, seeing not just the words, but all the versions of herself she had tried to hide over time. Thomas didn't press. He was just there. Sometimes he brought her wildflowers, sometimes just a hot cup of coffee, but always with a serene smile, the kind of presence that doesn't invade, just welcomes. And in that quiet, caring environment, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years, the freedom to make decisions without fear. One clear morning, with the sky clear as if it were a new beginning, she picked up the envelope and walked to the old mailbox on the side of the road. She stood there for a long time. Her hands were shaking. The wind blew steadily, as if to say, now or never. Eleanor put the letter inside the box, took a deep breath, and turned around. But before she took the first step back, she turned back, opened the box, and took out the envelope. It wasn't fear, it was intuition. It's not time yet, she thought, and she put the letter in her pocket, close to her chest. That afternoon, she told Thomas. He listened in silence without judging. You'll know when you go. The important thing is that you wrote. And she smiled for the first time since the letter arrived. A light smile, as if an old weight had been lifted from her shoulders. And then, that same day, Eleanor did something unexpected. She picked up the old radio, straightened the wires, and put on an old song. She asked Thomas to dance in the backyard, even though there was no reason. Today is just today, she said, and they danced. Not for celebration, but for existing. Thomas's ranch began to change. She spent entire afternoons there now, helping in the kitchen, reading aloud while he mended fences or made hay. They began to plant crops together, laughing at how she made crooked rows. Even the neighbors commented that old McBride seemed lighter. Eleanor was flourishing too. Her skin was gaining color, her eyes were bright. It was as if life had decided to repay the years of waiting with days of peace. And in that newfound calm, Thomas did something that surprised even himself. He wrote a letter, not to Eleanor, but to himself. He told her about his fears, about the love that never stopped existing, about the chance that life had given him. He folded the paper and put it in his bedside drawer. So that I will never forget, he said. Because he knew, redemption is not about forgetting the past. It is about writing a new story about it. And so it was, with 2 unsent letters and 2 open hearts, that they began to sew the gift with threads of courage and hope. It was spring when Thomas decided he needed to say what he felt. The trees were blooming again, the sky seemed bluer, and even the horses seemed to walk more lightly. He prepared everything simply, as was his way. He made a pie with his own hands, the same recipe Martha made for birthdays, and let it cool on the kitchen window. Eleanor would be home for dinner that night as always, but he knew this would be no ordinary dinner. When she arrived, the smell of the pie invaded her memories. You outdid yourself today, she said, sitting down at the table. Thomas smiled, but his eyes betrayed the tension. During dinner, he spoke little. He seemed to choose each word as if choosing a seed to plant. And when he finished dessert, he fell silent. Eleanor, sensing something different, just waited. And then he stood up, walked to the window, took a deep breath, and came back empty-handed. No box, no jewelry, no tradition, just his heart. I don't have a wedding ring, Eleanor, and maybe I won't have much time, but I have this land. I have this tired but sincere heart, and I have you here with me when everything seemed lost. She looked him in the eyes, with that silence that only she knew how to use. Thomas continued, his voice choked. I'm not asking you to be my wife. I'm asking you to be my home, here, with me, for as long as time allows. And he stood, waiting. The wind came through the window like a whisper from the earth itself. Eleanor stood up slowly, walked over to him, held his face in both hands and said, You've been my home for months now. I was just waiting for you to realize. They hugged there, in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by smells, memories, and futures that were slowly taking shape. There was no cinematic kiss. There was a touch of foreheads against foreheads, eyes closed, and the sound of one's own heart saying, yes. That night, she didn't go back to the cabin. She slept in Thomas's house, her head on his chest, and her feet intertwined like roots that had finally found fertile soil. The once cold bed now smelled of lavender and promise, and the full moon outside seemed to smile from behind the clouds. The next morning, the old radio played a song they didn't know, but which seemed made for that moment. After the proposal, life didn't turn into a fairy tale. It remained simple, real, full of small setbacks, But now there were two pairs of hands taking care of the land. Eleanor began to share with Thomas not only the stove and the pillow, but also the decisions on the ranch. They planted sunflowers near the fence to remind us that even the sun misses those who are gone, as she said. The neighbors came to visit more, attracted not only by her cakes, but by the peace that the place exuded. She left the cabin for a corner inside the main house. She brought her books, her cups, her mementos, and contrary to what Thomas had feared, her room fit into the house like a forgotten piece of an ancient puzzle. Her clothes in the closet mingled with his flannel shirts. The scent of lavender permeated the sheets, and life slowly began to feel whole. Not perfect, but alive. One day, as they were planting together under the clear sky, Eleanor looked at Thomas and said, "I think this land accepted my yes before I did." He smiled, wiped his sweaty brow, and replied, "It was just waiting for you." And it was true. Even the animals seemed calmer. The chickens laid more frequently. The cows mooed more calmly. Nature somehow recognized the presence of those who care for it with soul. Months later, they decided to make it official. No party, no guests. Just the two of them, on top of the hill where they had met. She was wearing a simple dress, and he was wearing the hat he had worn on the day he had been axed. They promised to take care of each other, as one takes care of the last flower in the field, even when winter comes. There was no priest, but there was a witness, the old oak tree under which they had danced for the first time. It seemed stronger that day. Back at home, Thomas built a wooden bench for the porch, with their names carved side by side, to sit and grow old without rushing. And so they did. Every afternoon after breakfast, they would sit there, holding hands, eyes on the horizon, sometimes in silence, sometimes laughing at some memory. Their love was unflattering. It was made up of details, hot tea, freshly baked bread, and a look that said it all without needing to be said. And the earth flourished with the yes of two hearts that after a long time decided to live again. The years passed like a breeze in an open field. Thomas and Eleanor did not measure time with calendars, but with harvests, seasons, and simple birthdays, with cornmeal cake and hot coffee. Her hair, already completely silver, shone like snow in the sun. He, slower in his steps, still maintained the strength in his eyes. They became living legends in the community, not for great deeds, but for being witnesses to a mature, calm love, strong as the roots of ancient trees. The porch of the McBride Ranch became a meeting place. Children came to hear stories, young people sought advice, and even adults sat down just to feel the peace that came from the silence shared between the two. Thomas spoke more than before, but always with pauses. Eleanor completed with gestures, glances, sighs. The two created a kind of language that was only theirs, where a touch or a smile was enough to say, "I'm here." And so they grew old, not just together, but intertwined. They had their routines. Every Friday was bread and jam day. Every Sunday they bathed their horses together. Every night they listened to soft music on the old radio. With each new wrinkle, there was also a new memory, and every ache in the body was treated with a caress on the face or a special tea. Time did not spare, but it did not take everything either. It left behind the essential, company, the simple fact of existing by each other's side. One day, sitting on the porch, Eleanor said, "You know, I thought life was over when he left, but it was just the beginning of my second half." Thomas took her hand, squeezed it lightly, and replied, "And I only learned to breathe again when you came along." They cried together, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude, for the chance they had, for the life they had built, for the home they had created without new bricks, but with soul. When a visitor asked her what their secret was, Eleanor would always answer with humor, patience, fresh bread, and a radio that never gives up. But deep down, everyone knew the secret was the love that was allowed to be born late. The love that doesn't require youth nor impossible promises. A love that is planted and cared for, like soil, like roots, like history. And in that house, amidst old songs and the smell of coffee, two hearts continued to beat, steady, like two ancestral drums marking the rhythm of a life lived truthfully. It was on a golden autumn afternoon, with the leaves covering the ground like a carpet of memories, that Thomas asked to dance once more. Eleanor laughed, saying that her knees were no longer the same, but he insisted, with that look that only he knew how to give. Let's dance, like that first day. We only need 2 steps and a little courage. She gave in, as she always did when love spoke louder. They turned on the old radio. The sound was faint but enough. The melody filled the air, and there, on the porch where it all began, they danced. Slowly, carefully, like someone dancing with time. Their hands intertwined, their eyes closed. Neither of them said anything, but in that moment, everything was said. The promises, the goodbyes, the new beginnings. Each step was a thank you. Each turn, an I love you. The sun set slowly, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, and when the song ended, they stood there, holding each other. Eleanor rested her head on Thomas's shoulder and said, "If this is the last autumn, it was the most beautiful." He kissed her forehead and replied, "As long as we dance, time will not catch up with us." And they stayed like that until night fell, until the wind cooled, until the music on the radio turned to a hiss and a memory. In the days that followed, the routine continued, but there was more silence, more contemplation, more affection in every detail. Life didn't tell them when the last dance would be, but they danced as if they knew, because love teaches us this, that everything can end except the way we look at each other. And on that balcony, between heaven and earth, between the past and the present, the scene of two hearts that decided to grow old together until the end was recorded. On the porch of the McBride Ranch, the steps of the last dance still seem to echo to those who pass by. There are no plaques or official records of that story, but those who know that land know. It was there that two hearts, marked by pain and shaped by life, decided to say yes to starting over. They didn't need luxury or applause, just each other, a song, and the courage to try again. The love that was born between Thomas and Eleanor was not young, but it was whole. It did not begin with passion, but with care, and it is this kind of love that time does not take away, that blooms even when everything seems dry. Perhaps what life expects of us is not haste, but patience. Perhaps happiness really lives in the details. A cup of tea, a silly laugh, fresh bread on the table, a dance on the porch. If this story touched your heart, share with someone who also deserves to believe that there is always time to start over. Subscribe to the channel. This helps us to continue telling stories like this, full of soul and hope. Send this video on WhatsApp for that special someone and leave it in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to hear how far this story goes. Thank you very much for following me this far. May love find you too, at the right time, in the most beautiful way. Until the next story.